Welcome, everyone, to the first of a series of webinars on beer. Today, we'll be putting a spotlight on classic British beer styles with the brilliant beer belle herself, Annabel Smith. WSET is the world's leading provider of qualifications and courses in wines and spirits, sake, and beer, and has over 50 years of experience in designing and delivering education for both professionals and enthusiasts. Our qualifications are offered in over 70 countries through a network of more than 800 course providers. And if you're interested in finding out more about our courses or signing up, just pop to our website, wsetglobal.com, to find your nearest course provider. Just a note, this webinar is being recorded and it will be available to watch on YouTube on the WSET Global Events Hub page. You'll all be sent to a link to it via email. If you've got any questions all the way through, please go ahead and ask lots of questions. You put them in the Q&A box. We'll try and answer as many as we can. So my name is Malcolm Fenter. I am an Educator Development Manager, and I'm in charge of beer, spirits, and sake. And we're basically the team that's responsible for training WSET educators. And the person that's going to be doing most of the talking today is Annabel Smith, and she is one of the world's leading experts on cask beer. She's a published author, she's a WSET beer educator, an IBD accredited beer sommelier. Having previously worked at Diageo and the Cask Mark Trust, she now runs her own business, Beer Belle. She is an absolute powerhouse, and we are so lucky to have her here with us today. Take it away, Annabel.
Okay, thanks for such a great introduction, Malcolm, and welcome to everyone who's joined this webinar. As Malcolm says, my name's Annabel Smith. Throughout the course of this webinar, if you do have any specific questions, could I ask you to put them in the chat? Because at various points throughout the presentation, I'll just take a quick break, go back to Malcolm, see what questions have popped up, and I'll try and answer them as we go along. My contact details will be going in the chat towards the end of the webinar, so please feel free to contact me if after today you think, oh, I wish I'd asked that question. Within the scope of this webinar, I'm not going to be able to cover every classic British beer style. So what I've been asked to do is pick 3 specific styles, which I think have got a very interesting backstory. And they're also styles which thrive and survive today, particularly in cask version. So the way I've split today up is I'm going to start talking about British beer in historical context, and I always think we should talk about beer in a fun way, so it's not going to be a very boring history lesson. It's just so you can understand why and where specific beer styles developed. I'm then going to have a look at the evolution of 3 classic British beer styles, which will be pale ale, stout, or porter. They're quite interchangeable nowadays. And also mild. And then in the next half of the webinar, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what cask beer is, cask conditioned beer, or it's also known as real ale. Again, within the scope of today, I could spend days talking to you about cask ale and how to handle it properly. So we're going to do a real whistle-stop tour through what it actually is and how to look after it. And then I'm going to take you through where cask beer fits into modern British beer culture. So the opportunities and the threats that it faces today. So let's kick off by painting a bit of a picture of what it looked like in Britain pre-industrial revolution. So that's pre about 1760. There was no heavy industry. There were no big towns and cities. There were rural communities which settled and grew up around arable farmland. Now, obviously, very, very heavy labour on the farmland. So farm labourers demanded a really nutritious, thirst-quenching drink from when they came in from the fields at the end of the day. And at this point, Britain had changed very, very little since medieval times. Now, Beer was brewed by an individual alewife or a brewster within the village, and beer was brewed to individual villagers' preferences. So the whole concept of styles of beer, like stout or pale ale, didn't really exist at this point in time. This is quite a modern concept, is beer styles. So whatever the villagers could get their hands on to brew with, whatever their particular preferences were, the brewster would brew that beer. Now, this is where the start of the modern British pub came from. We had alehouses in these days. Alehouses were basically somebody's cottage or somebody's house. And the ale that had been brewed would be served through a hatch, basically from someone's living room or dining room. But what it did do was it was a source of income for the village. So the beer that was brewed was sold at, should we say, a discounted level to the villagers. But any passing travellers, they would be able to buy beer at a bit of a premium. So beer brought in an income from the village. Now, this last point is really, really important in the context of beer. All beer was brewed with locally grown ingredients. So we've got to talk a little bit about the climate of Britain, that we're in a very cool maritime climate. We could also grow 2 crops of barley per year, which is why most beer is brewed with barley. We can only grow 1 crop of wheat per year, but with barley, we can grow it in the spring, we can grow it in the wintertime. So we have plentiful access to ingredients, which is something I'm going to come on to with my next slide. And I know that you'll know this if you've taken a WSET course in beer, but main ingredients in beer. We've got our malt or malted grains. So remember what I said about we can grow 2 crops of barley in Britain. So that was very important for these villagers. But what we were doing with the barley was we were malting it over charcoal or wood, which gave the grain a very smoky flavour, and it also made it very dark. Also, try and remember that the more you heat barley, you destroy the enzymes which convert the starch into sugar. So we didn't have a lot of sugar to work with to convert into alcohol. So a lot of beer was quite low strength. We then have the fact that even though we're a very tiny island, we've got a great variation in the types of water from north to south, from east to west. So the styles of beer the villagers were brewing was very dependent on the water supply, whether it was carbonate rich or sulfate rich, would present itself in the final beer. Hops. Now, we only started growing hops in the UK in the 1400s. Now, most hops, and still to this day, most bittering and aromatic hops are grown in the south and the Midlands of the UK because they've got the climate to grow hops like that. So again, thinking about this in context of beer styles, a lot of northern beer was quite muted on hops because we couldn't grow hops on our land. A lot of southern beers that were being brewed were very hop heavy because there were abundant harvests of hops. And the last ingredient, probably one of the most important, is yeast. Now, pre-18th century, we didn't really understand the role of yeast in beer making because we hadn't encountered this industrial nation and the role of science and technology. And I have to say that most villagers associated beer making with religion because what they thought was if we put malted grains with water and we flavour it with herbs or hops or spices, it's not a scientific process. Actually, what happens is God comes along, waves a magic wand, and all of a sudden you've got an alcoholic beverage, which makes you very happy. Very, very close associations between religion and beer during these times. Now, it sounds like an idyllic lifestyle, but actually, there were some drawbacks to this. First of all, we had a largely illiterate population. So people weren't writing recipes down. It was very much show and tell and pass those skills on. And what that led to is very inconsistent quality in beer making. You never quite knew what you were going to get because the measurements and the procedures and processes just weren't exact. There were also local taste preferences over specific styles. So going back to what I was talking about, hops, you would find that very less bitter beer was being brewed in the north, and that grew to be a local preference. Very highly hopped beer in the south. Again, very bitter beers became a preference. What we've got to remember is most of this beer was brown and smoky. And most importantly, beer had to be imbibed fresh. There was no refrigeration. There was no process to extend the shelf life of beer. So it's really, really important that once beer was produced, this live, unpasteurised product, that it was drunk almost immediately. So all this beer was packaged into casks, mainly wooden casks, or almost always wooden casks. And then what happened? Mid-18th century, like I say, about 1760, Britain went through a seismic change. We went from being those happy village people in an agricultural nation to a vast industrial nation. Now, what this actually looked like was we had mass migration from the villages to the newly growing urban towns and cities, which caused massive social upheaval and a massive population explosion. And I've got some stats to share with you. I was amazed by this. In London in 1801, the population was 1 million people. Within 100 years, that had grown to 5.5 million people, and they were all thirsty for beer. If we look at a northern town like Manchester, population in 1800 was 90,000 people. Within 100 years, that had increased tenfold to 1 million people. Same happened in Liverpool, another northern town. Birmingham, a town in the Midlands. And what was happening was, because we were starting to get these advances in technology and science, we had a massive advance in transportation links. So that's the canals, the roads, the railways, the ships. So instead of having to drink beer fresh immediately as soon as it came out of the fermentation vessels, we had to start thinking about, well, if we want to transport beer from Manchester to Leeds or London to Burton, we need to start thinking about some of the processes to keep that beer in perfect condition for when it arrives. Now, if you remember, I was talking about where were we selling beer in the villages. We were selling them in ale houses, which were people's houses. We started advancing to sell beer in inns and taverns. So we had the ale houses first, and then as people started to travel around the country, they were thirsty on their journeys. So this is where the coaching inns grew up. So we have a bit of a tradition in Britain in very, very old style pubs, where we have a tap room, which is where the working classes always were. So it was the people who were driving the coaches who would go into the tap room, and the lounge areas in the inns were for the wealthier classes. It was more like someone's sitting room, and they would be served beer at the table. The taverns grew up in the big cities. The taverns were really for the landed gentry, the not quite upper classes, but the moneyed people who wanted to go somewhere where they could talk business, enjoy a beer or two. In today's times, it would be very much like a gentleman's club. So yeah, ale houses were for the poor, inns were starting to kind of come to the middle classes, taverns for the upper classes. Now, around this time as well, the breweries that were growing up to feed all the populations of these cities realised there was some massive domestic and international commercial opportunities. We could put Britain on the map with the beer that we were brewing. So the government also got hold of this and thought, well, this is also a massive source of taxation. So it was a source of income for the country. Again, what I'm trying to do is paint a picture. The population explosion actually created a lot of poverty in the big cities. A lot of the poor working classes were working in factories, in mills. The conditions were absolutely grim. So if you've no running water, if you've no electricity, if your house isn't heated, where do you go? You go to an ale house or an inn or a tavern. So in Britain, there's this intrinsic link between beer making and where we actually go and drink it. So to make sure we advance from being a cottage brewing industry to brewing on a large scale, there were some massive advances in science and technology. So this is where we saw the growth of the new big commercial breweries in these newly industrial formed towns and cities. So first of all, I'm going to talk about the role a little bit of Louis Pasteur, because Louis Pasteur was really the chap who came along and said, look, folks, it's not magic. It's not God. There is a scientific process to brewing beer, and it's all to do with the yeast. So he gave us a great understanding of the role of individual ingredients in beer and also how to preserve beer quality through processes such as pasteurisation. What he also did was have a look at cask beer and say, right, we're no longer going to be able to drink it straight from the brewery, so we need to look at a process whereby we kind of halt the process of fermentation, we part brew it, and then we can transport it to the other towns and cities in the UK, and it can be finished off in the pub, cask conditioned beer. Technology, we needed to manufacture a lot of machinery to upscale production. So again, there was a lot of civil engineering going on to make sure that we could transport this beer to other parts of the world. And equally important was our understanding of ingredients. So whereas in the villages, they had malted grains of charcoal, so it's really smoky and dark, we started looking at other processes where we could say, right, how do we retain those enzymes? How do we make sure we can get paler beers, we can vary the colour, and we can vary the styles instead of everything being brown, a bit murky and smoky. So this is where specific recipe styles started evolving, and we started getting consistent styles and quality of beer. Again, let me refer it back to cask. All beer was still being packaged in cask. It was still live and it was in unpasteurised, but the process had changed slightly. Right, before I go any further onto taking you into classic British beer styles, I'm just going to ask my friend Malcolm, are there any questions that have popped up in the chat that I could answer straight away?
Nothing's popped up in the chat, but I'm dying to ask you a question. And that is, I'm so interested in this link to Louis Pasteur and cask beer, because I didn't know anything about that. And was cask beer, was he in France at the time? When did he invent this system? Or was it in the UK?
Louis Pasteur was very widely travelled. Even though he was French, he was looking into lots of different processes in medicine and science and brewing. He got a particular interest in brewing. So it was when he was over in Britain that he looked at this fresh beer that people were very, very passionate about. As you probably all know, if you take any food product through a pasteurisation process, you actually alter the flavour of it, and sometimes to a detrimental effect. So Louis Pasteur was very, very passionate about retaining the flavours in this real beer, but in a way that it could be preserved for longer than just a day or two. Does that answer your question?
I think that's amazing. That's really fascinating. Thank you so much.
I think we've got a lot to thank Louis Pasteur for in modern British brewing terms. Okay, so I'm going to push on a little bit, and I'm going to preempt talking about individual beer styles by coming back to the categorising of beer into styles is a relatively modern concept. just to explain, styles are what we use to differentiate beers based on a particular set of characteristics. And not all cultures in the world buy into this concept of beer styles. But it's very, very helpful for drinkers or consumers because a particular combination of ingredients or processes or brewing techniques can be linked to a name. And what that does is if you're presented with, say, a stout, in your head, you kind of think, yeah, I know it's probably going to be dark and I know it's going to have coffee and roasted flavours. So you've got an idea of what that beer is going to taste like. We're setting up expectations for the drinkers. And my friend at WSET, Natalia, has a great analogy that she uses for this. She says, every country in the world probably has their own recipe for spaghetti bolognese, but it differs from town to city to country. But if you say to anyone, I'm going to make a spaghetti bolognese tonight, you kind of know it's going to have pasta there. You know that you're probably going to have a ragu sauce and there's going to be some tomatoes. It's setting up that expectation. So I really like to use that analogy when we're talking about beer styles because they're not legally defined, but we get an expectation of what that beer style will be. And just kind of, again, caveat this, there probably were versions of milds and ales and porters and stouts in that agricultural nation, but we just didn't label them. Okay, it's at this period in history where we start looking at, right, that is what defines that particular beer. So let's talk about stout. Now, stout was originally a name for any strong beer, not necessarily a dark beer, but it's now become one of the most distinctive beer styles in the world. Dark, robust, quite complex. It began its life as a variation of porter, which emerged in the early 18th century London by blending young beers with aged beers. Now, there are lots and lots of different historians with different stories about how certain beer styles emerged. A very, very popular story about porter is that when publicans took their delivery of beer, they would ask their customers what style of beer they would like, and they would take different samples of beer from different casks and blend it on site. What publicans would do is they would probably use a young beer, a beer that had been aged a bit, and then a beer that was probably on the turn, going off a little bit. They would mix it in and blend it all together. And these different samples of beer were all called threads. You would probably have 3 threads of beer mixed together in a tankard. That is the popular story because people love that story. Actually, what happened was the brewers in London noticed threads being mixed in pubs and they said, oh, that's a bit labour intensive. We could do that at the brewery. So it was the London brewers who started mixing young beers, aged beers and staled beers together. And porter became the first mass-produced commercial ale. One of the reasons it's called porter is around the London area, there were lots of strong men for hire who would be carting loads of produce, things like fish and dry goods on the backs from the merchants to the storehouses to the city's public markets. Again, they needed something really thirst quenching. And porter became known as kind of, well, it's also very nutritious. It's very good for you. So this is where it got its popularity from. So you're probably thinking, hang on a minute, Annabel, why are you talking so much about porter when you've chosen stout as a classic style? Well, this is where, again, the role of science and technology comes in. Because in 1817, a chap called Daniel Wheeler invented something called the drum roaster. He was inspired by coffee roasters. And what this did was it protected malt from direct flame. So brewers all of a sudden had a reliable malt, a consistent supply of malt that produced a dark beer without those harsh burned notes. And it allowed production of a black patent malt, a hallmark roasted flavour rather than a burnt flavour. And again, very clever chap, Daniel Wheeler. What he discovered was by fine tuning and temperature, he could create lighter malts, like caramel malts. So we could start producing lighter beers as well. Now, what this process did was it converted starch into sugars because we weren't destroying all the enzymes in the malt. So we could get more sugar in each grain of malted barley, which meant we could produce more alcohol and more fizz, i.e. booze and bubbles. And what this did was it added sweetness to porters and stouts. Now, again, I'm going to emphasise it was all packaged in cask. So how did stout become such a powerhouse? Well, basically, it became dominated by the Irish in the 19th century. Irish brewers perfected dry stout, and combined with the marketing genius that was Guinness, Guinness's brand power kept stout alive and made it relevant. London Porter itself declined. But Irish stout thrived. Now, Irish stout is quite dry, and it doesn't have a very prominent hop character to it. But what brewers found was that stout could lend itself to lots and lots of different variations. So, for example, a sweet milk stout. Lactose adds sweetness to stout. And this is where one of these myths about, I would imagine if you ask your mum or your grandma, did they drink alcohol when they were pregnant? They sometimes say, oh yes, I was allowed a Guinness, or I was allowed a milk stout, because it was thought to be very, very nutritious while women were pregnant. Oatmeal stout was a smoother and silkier version, so more imbibable. And then if you like your really strong dark beers, we've got a stout, an imperial stout, which is very strong, very rich, perfect for export. Now, Malcolm mentioned right at the beginning that I worked for Diageo as a while, and I've looked into the history, a lot of history about Guinness. But basically in the UK, certainly in Britain, Guinness was in a bit of a decline in the late 1990s. It was seen as a bit of an old man's drink, associated with those smoky backstreet pubs. Now, this is where Guinness's marketing genius and innovation comes in, because they said, why are younger people not drinking Guinness? It's because they've got used to the cold, crisp flavours of the lagers that came in throughout the 50s and 60s. So Guinness was the first brand to introduce an extra cold variant of their beer, and it was originally designed to capture a younger audience of drinkers, and it worked. Because it introduced stout to a whole new generation. Now, preceding this, in the 1970s, a lot of craft breweries, especially in the US, rediscovered stouts. And they started brewing different variants. So chocolate, coffee, pastry, barrel-aged, fruit stouts, peanut butter stouts. As I say, stout is a great beer to add different flavours and textures to. Today, stout and porter are still a little bit interchangeable, okay? If I was explaining to someone what's the difference between a stout and porter, a novice beer drinker, I would probably say, if you like an espresso coffee, try a stout. If you love a cafe latte, have a porter. It's just a bit silkier than a stout. You can learn all about this if you do your level 1 or 2 award in beer at WSET, because all of these kind of aromas and colours of beer come out whilst we're doing the tasting of the systematic approach to tasting. It's really, really interesting to find out more. So I'm going to move on to another beer style. I'm going to move on to pale ale. Now, pale ale, I've got to caveat this by saying pale ale is not just a single beer, it's a whole family of styles. But what pale ale did was it transformed brewing by introducing a lighter colour to beer, brighter flavour, and a really clean malt base. So remember, pre-1700s, most beers were dark and smoky, unrefined. Malt was dried over wood or charcoal. By the early 1700s, we were starting to malt malt grain with coke, which was smokeless fuel, smokeless coal. And it produced a lighter coloured malt without that typical smoky flavour. What this did was it allowed brewers to make pale ales for the first time. So we need to define pale, because sometimes you can get a pale ale which is amber coloured, or mahogany coloured, or golden coloured, or honey coloured. The word pale refers to the style. It was paler than any of the beers we had brewed pre-industrial revolution, if that makes sense. Pale ales were perfect brewed in areas where we had sulfate-rich water, because what sulfates do is they accentuate hot bitterness, and this really defined the style, a balance between the hot bitterness and that bite, and also the malt sweetness. So if we think about a town that's very, very famous for brewing in the UK, it's Burton-upon-Trent. The water on a 30-mile radius around Burton-upon-Trent is very, very sulfate rich. Pale ales became associated with quality, clarity, and refinement. They were more expensive to make, but they were more drinkable than some of the smoky dark beers that we'd had before. Now, putting this into context of the blueprint for modern beer, we have to remember that during the Industrial Revolution, and I might be slightly ashamed to say this, we were in charge of the British Empire. Now, the British Empire included territories in every continent in the world, and about a quarter of the world's landmass and population came underneath the British Empire. So we had an immediate market to ship pale ale out to all those colonies, all those territories that we thought we owned. Now, to survive those journeys, we needed to put in extra hops, because hops have those antibacterial properties. We need to dial up the alcohol level in pale ales to make sure that they would be the beer will be preserved on long sea journeys. And it led to styles such as India Pale Ale, or what we know now as India Pale Ale. Now, Pale Ale, or particularly IPA, went into decline in the mid-20th century. One of the reasons was we had been through two large-scale world wars, so massive European conflict, which led to a restriction on brewing ingredients. We had a lot of shortages. And during the late 1950s, early 60s and 70s, pale ales lost market share to lighter, cheaper beers which were coming in from the continent. They were also easier to look after because they were packaged in kegs, and they were pasteurised, they had a longer shelf life. And pale ale only really went through a revival in the 1970s and 1980s, when a lot of the US craft beers and home brewers said, look, the Brits had these recipes for these amazing pale ales and IPAs, and they're not brewing them anymore to the original recipes. But we've got the hops, we've got the crops, so why don't we start brewing a modern style version of pale ales, which is where we've got things like your hazy pale ales and your West Coast pale ales and your New England IPAs and all those different variations of pale ales. And it's introduced it to a new market. But as I go back to saying, pale ale just shows how a single innovation, that pale malt, can redefine an entire industry. I love this quote from a beer writer called Pete Brown, and he said, pale ale, it's the beer that changed beer forever. And I agree with that. Right, moving on. The third beer style that I picked was mild. And I love the backstory to mild. Originally, mild was a general term for fresh beer. And it was made and sold quickly. It was a cheap beer to make, still is. It was relatively low in bitterness, That's where the term mild comes from. It's nothing to do with the strength of the beer, it's to do with mild flavour. And it had a greater emphasis on its malt character compared to pale ales. Now, all beers were once known as mild until they become matured. And because mild didn't need to be aged, it could be drunk young. That's why it was a lot cheaper. Now, its sweetish flavour, drinkability and modest strength made it an ideal thirst quencher after working in a mill or a pit. Remember those big factories that grew up in the cities and towns? And what happened is this led to it being associated with blue-collar workers, basically the working classes. And it does have a great, in Britain, it has a much higher profile in the Midlands and the north of the country than it perhaps does in the south. Now, by the 1930s, mild accounted for more than 3/4 of all beer brewed in Britain. Malcolm, can I just check, have you got your hand up there?
Yeah, just got a few questions for you, and it felt like a good spot to
cool. Let's go for it then.
Pop them in. So the first one is going back to the sort of cask beer piece.
Yeah.
And the question from Guillermo is, why did cask beer not grow in other countries? If Pasteur was mainly working in Carlsberg in Denmark, he says.
Right, okay. There are two things. I'm going to come on to this towards the end, but just very, very kind of bullet point. First of all, it was to do with our climate and our culture of ale houses. A lot of cellars are subterranean in the UK. Therefore, cask ale can be kept at the perfect temperature of 11 to 13 degrees without that need for mechanical refrigeration. And that's still the case to today. A lot of pubs have subterranean cellars, so beer doesn't go off. Second part of the question. So why? Yeah. Actually, getting cask ale ready for preparation takes a lot of skill, and it's an art form to doing it. So if the expertise and the training isn't in place in other countries, they don't know how to do it. So that's one of the reasons why we've kind of kept up with this knowledge and this art and this skill of looking after cask beer, but it's been somewhat lost in other European cities and other continents.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. There are a couple of others.
Yeah.
I think I'm going to ask a question on mild quickly, because you've just done that one.
Yeah.
And that is from Joe Morgan. And he asks, the mild referring to lower bitterness and what you said earlier about the difficulty of growing hops in the north of England. Is that why more mild is drunk in the north than in the south?
Yes. Lack of hops is one reason, but also most heavy industry was in the Midlands and the north. And the factory, the mill owners, did not want their workers going out and, to use a colloquialism, getting plastered every night on high strength beer, because they just wouldn't turn up for work, or if they did turn up for work and they were operating heavy machinery, there were more likely to be accidents and fatalities. So mild suited the factory owners absolutely perfectly, because they could imbibe vast quantities, but because the alcohol length was quite low, they wouldn't kind of turn up to work still inebriated.
That's brilliant. There is a question on IPA. Is this a good time to ask, or should we ask it later on?
Let's go for it.
All right. This is from Gillian Bruni. Is the origin of IPA linked to preservation for transport, or rather to an adaptation of pale ale to local tastes? From my point of view, my research, the idea of IPA being hoppier to withstand the elements is more of an urban legend.
Right. There are two theories of thought on this. Folklore loves the story about, oh, we packaged these casks onto ships and they were high in alcohol and high in hops, and they lasted a 6-month journey to India, and all the troops out in India went, this amazing British beer. It's a lovely, lovely story. But actually, more recent research has shown that it was more to do with locality and people's tastes at the time. I think it was probably a happy accident that we realised that, oh, if you pack a beer full of hops, it's more than likely to last a little bit longer, and therefore we can transport it. So, yeah, I think, to be honest, there are books and books and books about the origins of IPA. You pick your favourite. Okay. Right, let's get back to mild. Okay, so remember what I was saying, that it was drink of the working classes. And after the end of the Second World War, 1945, mild really went into a decline. We had a long, long period of rationing after the end of World War II. So the strength of mild got slashed even more. It got a reputation as being a bit of a wishy-washy beer. It struggled to retain its reputation. But if you think about today's culture and a lot of today's modern drinkers, look at the growth of the no and low alcohol market. And a mild revival has been on the cards for the last decade. Several breweries have done a really good job of marketing mild to younger drinkers who appreciate not only its lower strength, but its mellower flavour. And I think mild is a great gateway beer for people who say, I don't like beer, because they're not going to be put off by any elevated bitterness or strength. It's just a lovely, easy drinking beer. We have a movement in Britain which launches Mild May every May and tries to encourage pubs to stock a mild so people can experience it in cask version. Which leads me on to, what do these three British styles have in common? They were all originally produced in cask, and they still are to this day. So before I go on to kind of a little bit of technicality about cask beer, Malcolm, any questions that have popped up that I can answer before I do this?
Sure. So the first one is from Jeremy. Going back to pale ale, is the differentiator for ESBs brewed in the UK today only a slightly higher ABV? Or do ESBs use a different combination of pale versus crystal or other malts?
Great question. In terms of styles, we put ESB under the bitter style. And bitter is a catch-all term. Bitter can mean amber. Bitter can mean ESB. It can mean just ale. ESB is typically high in strength, extra special bitter or extra strong bitter, two interchangeable terms. Typically brewed with a base malt, a pale malt, okay, but the additional things like speciality malts like crystal malt will give it a darker colour. It will give it a richer flavour to it. But again, the specification is that sweetness is perfectly balanced out by the hops that go into it. If you want to, am I allowed to mention a brand name, Malcolm?
Go for it.
Right, okay. If you want to try great ESB, go for Fuller's ESB, which is in bottles as well as in cask. So it should be quite widely available from merchants.
Fantastic. Thank you, Annabel. And then Carmen's just asking the analogy between stout and cafe latte and porter, and she missed that second piece. If stout is cafe latte, what is porter?
No. So stout was a rich, dark espresso coffee.
Okay, there we go.
And your porter kind of, it takes some of that. Porter traditionally tend to be less bitter. So it's more like a cafe latte. It's sweeter, silkier, smoother. So yeah, the stout espresso porter cafe latte.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Annabel. Then somebody has asked, can they have the files from your presentation? I think I can answer that, Jaddy. This presentation is being recorded, so we'll send you guys all a link to the recording, and that's going to be much more useful to you. Brilliant.
Okay,
Thank you, Annabel.
That's great. Okay. Right. So cask beer. I've got a particular passion for cask beer, partly because it's where I started my beer journey. I started pulling pints 30 odd years ago in a little backstreet pub that was very renowned for its cask beer. At the time, I didn't drink beer at all, but I had a great, great boss who wanted to teach me all about this weird and wonderful British beer that we have. So let's define it. Cask beer, when it leaves the brewery, is unfiltered. It's unpasteurized, live beer. By live, I mean it still has living yeast cells in that beer. It's unfinished. It will be undrinkable because it's only been through primary fermentation at the brewery. Now, the ingredients are all the same. When I'm explaining this to at events and people go, what exactly is cask beer compared to that lager that we've got on the bar? The way I say it is lager is a little bit like a pre-packaged sandwich. All the ingredients are the same as cask beer, but all you need to do is you need to open the packet and you can eat it straight away. Cask beer is a little bit like those deliver at home meal kits, HelloFresh, Gusto. All the components are there, but you actually have to apply time and temperature and sanitation and skill to end up with a finished product. So when we get cask beer into a cellar, it undergoes a further process of fermentation in the vessel. Basically, we wake the yeast up in there. And what that does, the yeast goes, brilliant, there's a source of sugar in here. And it creates a gentle carbonation and it develops all the aromas and the flavours of the beer. Now, it's dispensed through a piece of equipment called a hand pump. You might find Brits calling this a hand pull, or they might go, what beer's on the wickets on the bar? Or what beer's on the pumps on the bar? I'm sorry, my phone is ringing there. So we have different terms for it, but it's also known as real ale, cask ale, and cask conditioned beer. Malcolm, could I just hand over to you whilst I turn this phone off?
Of course you can.
Thank you.
I'm going to actually answer a question that I sort of answered in the text, but I just want to clarify a little bit. The question was, wasn't the first light beer brewed in the early 1700s? And it wasn't. There were paler beers than, stouts and porters, definitely. But it was really difficult to get this very, very light style of beer to come in. And true golden beers that, we sort of think about now with modern lagers only really start in 1842 in Pilsen, really. All right, Anna?
Thank you, Malcolm, for taking over while someone tried to contact me there. Right.
Not a problem.
Okay. So cask beer, we need to apply certain processes to it when it comes into the cellar. So we need to apply time because all cask beer contains sediment. So that sediment needs to settle. We also need that cask to acclimatise to cellar temperature because it may have been transported from 50, 60, 100 miles away on an unrefrigerated wagon. So we need to allow it to acclimatise to that cellar temperature because if we tried to open that cask and it was a little bit warm, it would be like taking the top off a bottle of Coca-Cola or lemonade. We would lose an awful lot of the carbonation because it's been all shook up and it's the wrong temperature, and then we end up with flat beer. So by getting it, allowing it to settle, giving it a bit of time, we're enabling it to create the correct level of carbon dioxide. Temperature, really, really important. All beer misbehaves if it's kept in the wrong temperature. So we sell a cask ale at 11 to 13 degrees, and that is the perfect temperature to activate the live yeast in the container. We also need to keep an eye on temperature, because if it gets too warm in the cellar, we're going to create some spoilage in the beer. If it gets too cold, what happens with cask beer is it can pick up something called a chill haze, and it goes a little bit cloudy, so it affects its appearance. The most important thing is keeping cask beer at that cellar temperature, 11 to 13 degrees. It maintains the correct level of CO2 or carbon dioxide in the beer. And thirdly, sanitation. Sanitation is critical to minimise bacterial infection. Remember, we've got a live unpasteurised food product here. And also, if we're keeping it in a dirty environment, or there's something in that environment that could possibly cross-contaminate with the beer, we're going to start getting off flavours and aromas in it. The most critical thing about cask beer is that once we put it on sale, once we pull through that first pint on the bar, we need to try and sell it within 3 days. The reason being, every time you pull a pint through that hand pump on the bar, you pull a pint of beer into a glass, you pull a pint of air into the cask in the cellar. And it's air that's a big enemy of beer. So on day one, you've got perfect beer because you've more beer than air in the cask. Day two, we're starting to introduce more air. And no matter how clean and clinical my environment is, all air contains ambient yeast and bacteria. So we're introducing that into a cask. Now, by day 4, we've probably got more air in that container than we have beer. And that causes oxidation and results in stale beer and sour beer and flat beer. And this is one of the reasons why during the kind of 50s and 60s and early 70s in Britain, cask beer really fell out of flavour because it was labour intensive, publicans were getting wastage, and we had this new and easy, ready to drink keg product. For example, lagers and keg ales. So you might think, well, why has cask survived in Britain to this day? Well, there are a few reasons. These are just some key ones. In 1971, an organisation called the Campaign for Real Ale was founded. It was basically 4 chaps who met in a pub and they said, we're just not getting the variety of beer anymore. Every pub we go in, it's all the same beer. Britain is dominated by 6 breweries, all producing the same style of beer. And what they did, they set up a voluntary consumer organisation, voluntary organisation. By 2000, CAMRA was the biggest voluntary consumer organisation in Europe. It had 175,000 members, which showed how passionate people in Britain were about making sure they had access to cask-conditioned ale and a choice of ales. We also have to consider that we cannot buy cask-conditioned beer as we know it in the grocery or the corner shop or in the supermarket aisle, because all of that beer in those aisles does tend to be pasteurised or sterile filtered to make it stable for grocery shelves. So if you love your cask beer, you have to go to the pub to experience it. So it's a bit of a benefit for Britain's pub culture. I mentioned earlier that cask has survived because we have the equipment and the environments, those subterranean cellars, which kept ideal temperature conditions. And I think across the world, there has been a big push for authenticity in beer, a focus on freshness, flavour, and natural ingredients. We have all those ingredients on our doorstep in Britain. We do not need to import any of them. I do have to balance this out by saying there are threats to cask as well. It does take skill to look after it. An analogy I use is if I wanted to go into the catering industry and be a chef in a kitchen, I would have to have very specific training on how to cook a steak and what temperature to serve particular foods at. And we need to apply that to cask as well. And we need to train the next generation on how to look after this really uniquely special beer product. Another threat to cask is quality. If pubs are keeping it on for longer than 3 days, the quality is going to suffer. What I've found out and about is too many pubs are putting too many beers on the bar at any one time. And at the moment where we've just come into November, our climate has cooled down, we're coming up to Christmas, pubs aren't that busy at the moment. We need to make sure that we have the correct amount of beers on the bar to suit the custom that's coming in. Otherwise, quality is going to suffer. It is worth noting that the amount of breweries in the UK has increased, but the amount of pubs has decreased. In the last decade, we have lost 15,000 pubs in the UK. Remember, a pub is the only place where we can condition cask beer. So there's less of a marketplace for it. And there are also some negative stereotypes or perceptions about cask, which we're starting to overcome now. I'm of a generation that got used to very, very cold beer. So this generation now thinking, well, cask ale's warmer than lager or warmer than that extra cold Guinness. Or it's certainly not as fizzy as a lager. So there's the perception that it's flat. It's not. It's got natural carbonation in it. And also there are associations with it being a masculine drink and associated with older drinkers. However, new beer drinkers to the market, the first time they experience cask, it's probably one of the most flavoursome, aromatic beers they can possibly try. And if you can find it in your own country, or if you want to come to the UK and experience it, it's well worth seeking out. I am all done here. So I'd like to thank you for joining the seminar. I'm happy to answer any more questions that you might have in the time we have left.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you, Annabel. Right, so there are a few that we can quickly go through. So Matthew asks, he assumes there's a limited time frame for casking. That's the reason that there's a smaller size of keg. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah, a lot of that's such a great question. The majority of the container sizes that British brewers produce are 9 gallons, which are called firkins. We have to get through 9 gallons within 3 days. So 24 pints a day per pump. So what a lot of the breweries have started doing is investing in pins, which is a 4.5 gallon container. Still needs to be sold within 3 days, but basically because he's selling it quicker, the quality is not compromised. So breweries such as Green King and Sharps have invested millions in pins.
Fantastic. And there's so many questions here now. I think I'm going to ask a couple. Unfortunately, we're not able to get through all of them. But one question that I think is really relevant is, can bottle conditioned beer be considered real ale, or does it have to be cask conditioned?
Technically, we don't define bottle conditioned beer as real ale. What we can say is it's the nearest thing in terms of a flavour profile to real ale that you can get, that you can buy in the off-trade, that you can buy in a bottle. CAMRA, Campaign for Real Ale, do have a category for the champion bottled beer of Britain. it all has to be bottle conditioned for it to enter that category.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. And we are out of time. Firstly, I'd just like to say thank you so much, Annabel. You were amazing as always, and I learned loads, as I always do. And I'd also like to thank all of our attendees. Thank you all so much for watching. There's a feedback poll that will have come up on your screen a couple of minutes ago. We'd obviously really appreciate it if you fill that in for us. And the recording of the session will be available to watch on the WSET Events Hub on YouTube, where you can catch up on our previous events too. And, you know, if you'd like to find out more and sign up for our beer qualifications, if you go to the WSET Global website, you can find there's a where to study page that you can click on, and it will find somewhere that is close to you or works for you, and you can investigate more in our beer courses. And if you've enjoyed today, I highly recommend it. All right, thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.